September 26, 2000, Aegean Sea, near Psarros Island, Greece. Captain Vasilis Giannakis, 58 years old, stood on the bridge of the Express Samina, a 407-ton passenger ferry, carrying 533 people from Piraeus to Psarros. The night was calm, visibility perfect, seas glassy smooth, ideal conditions for the routine crossing he'd made hundreds of times over his 35-year maritime career. "I'm going down to my cabin for a bit," he told Third Officer Ikaros Romeos, 25 years old, who was nominally in charge of navigation. "You have the con, maintain course and speed." What Captain Giannakis didn't tell anyone, what he would later desperately deny, was that he was going to his cabin to watch the Champions League football match between Panathinaikos and Hamburg. The match had kicked off at 9:45 p.m. The Express Samina was scheduled to reach Psarros at 10:15 p.m. 30 minutes, he'd watch the first half, return to the bridge before arrival. Simple, routine. Nothing could go wrong on a clear night with an experienced crew. The irony was suffocating. The Express Samina was equipped with modern navigation equipment, GPS, radar, electronic charts, automated collision warning systems. But all these systems required someone to monitor them, someone to interpret warnings, someone to take action when danger approached. The bridge, designed to be manned by a captain and two officers working together, was now being monitored by a single inexperienced third officer, who was simultaneously trying to navigate the ship, watch the radar, plot the course, and fatally, who had also turned his attention to the football match on a small television he'd brought to the bridge. The Express Samina was a roll-on/roll-off passenger ferry, one of dozens operating in the Greek islands, transporting tourists and locals between Athens and the Cyclades. Built in 1966 as the course, she'd operated for 34 years under various owners and names. By 2000, she was aging, her safety systems dated, her watertight doors often malfunctioning. But she was profitable, and in the competitive Greek ferry market, profit mattered more than perfection. The ship was owned by Minoan Flying Dolphins, a company that operated a fleet of ferries and hydrofoils. The company had a mixed safety record, several minor incidents, some near misses, persistent complaints about maintenance standards, but nothing catastrophic, nothing that had triggered regulatory intervention or threatened the company's operating licenses. On this September evening, the Express Samina carried 533 people, 449 passengers and 84 crew. Among the passengers were tourists ending summer vacations in the Greek islands, Greek families returning from visits to Athens, teenagers heading to Psarros for the nightlife. The passengers included Swedes, Germans, Britons, Americans and Greeks, a typical international mix for Aegean ferry travel. The Portinos family, Dimitris, 42, his wife Elena, 39 and their children, Andreas, 14 and Maria, 11, were returning to their home on Naxos after a weekend in Athens visiting relatives. They'd boarded at Piraeus at 6 p.m., expecting to reach Psarros at 10:15 p.m., then transfer to another ferry to Naxos. The crossing was routine, something they'd done dozens of times. "Can we go up on deck?" Andreas asked his father as the ferry cruised through the dark Aegean. "It's too windy," Dimitris replied, though actually the night was unusually calm. "Stay inside, we'll be there soon." That decision to stay in the interior passenger lounge rather than on the open deck would save their lives. At 9:45 p.m., as Captain Giannakis left the bridge, Third Officer Romeos was alone with the helmsman, an able seaman whose job was to steer the ship according to the officer's orders. The Express Samina was on autopilot, maintaining a preset course toward Psarros. The radar showed no other vessels nearby. The GPS indicated the ship was on course, making 18 knots, just over 20 miles per hour. Everything was normal, routine, safe. What neither Romeos nor the helmsman noticed, what they would have noticed if they'd been properly monitoring navigation equipment, was that the autopilot course, programmed earlier by the captain, was taking the ship dangerously close to a well-known hazard, the Portis Islets, a cluster of rocks just north of Psarros. The rocks were marked on all charts, well documented in sailing directions, notorious among Aegean mariners as a navigation hazard. The standard safe route to Psarros passed well south of Portis, giving the rocks a clearance of at least 2 nautical miles. But the Express Samina's course, whether due to programming error, navigational miscalculation, or attempt to shorten the route, was taking the ship within a few hundred meters of the rocks. At 9:55 p.m., the ship's radar showed the Portis islets as a clear return, a bright cluster of echoes indicating land ahead. Standard procedure required the officer to identify all radar contacts, assess collision risk, and alter course as necessary. Third Officer Romeos glanced at the radar intermittently, but was distracted by paperwork, by preparations for arrival at Psarros, and fatally, by a small television he'd brought to the bridge showing the football match. At 10:03 p.m., the Express Samina's automated collision warning system activated, emitting a loud alarm on the bridge. The system had detected land ahead, calculated the ship's course was leading toward collision, and triggered a warning. The alarm was loud, distinctive, impossible to ignore. Third Officer Romeos silenced the alarm. He glanced at the radar, saw the land return, but misidentified it. He thought it was Psarros Island itself, destination, not the Portis rocks, which were a hazard between the ship and Psarros. This was a catastrophic navigational error. He believed the ship was approaching its destination normally, when actually it was seconds from striking rocks at 18 knots. The helmsman, focused on maintaining the autopilot course, noticed nothing wrong. He wasn't trained in navigation or chart reading. His job was to steer, and the autopilot was steering. Everything seemed normal. At 10:05 p.m., the Express Samina struck the Portis rocks at full speed. The impact was devastating. The ship's bow hit submerged rocks, which ripped open the hull along 30 meters of its length. The tier extended below the waterline across multiple watertight compartments. The forward section of the ship, containing vehicle decks, crew quarters and storage, began flooding immediately. On the bridge, Third Officer Romeos was thrown forward by the impact. The helmsman grabbed the wheel instinctively. Though the ship was no longer responding normally, the bow was stuck on rocks, but the stern continued moving forward due to momentum, causing the ship to pivot and roll slightly to port. Romeos finally, realized the catastrophic error. He grabbed the radio. "Captain to the bridge. Captain to the bridge immediately. We've hit rocks." In his cabin, Captain Yanakis heard the impact and the call. He ran to the bridge, arriving within 30 seconds. "What happened?" he demanded. "We struck Portis, sir. Forward hull is breached." Yanakis looked at the radar and GPS, saw their position, understood immediately the scale of disaster. They'd hit the one obstacle every mariner knew to avoid, in perfect weather, with all navigation equipment functioning. This was incomprehensible negligence, but there was no time for recrimination. The ship was flooding. "Sound general alarm," Yanakis ordered. "Get everyone to muster stations, prepare lifeboats." The general alarm, 7 short blasts followed by 1 long blast, sounded throughout the ship at 10:06 p.m., 1 minute after impact. For most passengers, the alarm was their first indication anything was wrong. The impact had been felt, a grinding shudder, a sudden deceleration, but many had thought it was just rough seas or the ship maneuvering. In the passenger lounge, Dimitris Portinos heard the alarm and immediately understood. "Life jackets, now," he shouted to his family. They grabbed life jackets from overhead compartments and began putting them on, following the safety demonstration they'd ignored during boarding. All around them, other passengers were doing the same, some calm, some panicking, many confused about what was happening. Crew members appeared, shouting instructions in Greek and broken English. "Muster stations, go to your muster stations." But there was a problem. Most passengers didn't know where their muster stations were. The mandatory safety briefing, supposed to occur shortly after departure, hadn't happened. The safety cards in seat pockets were in Greek only. Many tourists didn't speak Greek, and crucially, the crew members shouting instructions didn't know which passengers belonged at which stations. Chaos developed quickly. Passengers crowded toward exits, unsure where to go. Crew members pointed in different directions, sometimes contradicting each other. The ship's public address system broadcast conflicting instructions, first telling people to stay calm and return to their cabins, then telling them to proceed to muster stations, then calling crew to their emergency posts. The Express Samina's passenger capacity was 533, but it carried only 16 lifeboats and life rafts, enough for approximately 600 people if all equipment functioned and if evacuation was orderly and calm, but there was nothing orderly or calm about what was happening. The ship was tilting to port as flooding progressed. The list made walking difficult, caused loose objects to slide across floors, and most critically, made launching lifeboats on the starboard side nearly impossible. Lifeboats are designed to launch when a ship is level or listing slightly. As list increases, boats on the high side can't reach the water, while boats on the low side may swing into the ship's hull. At 10:10 p.m., 5 minutes after impact, the list reached 15 degrees. Passengers on interior decks struggled to climb stairs tilted at steep angles. In the vehicle deck, unsecured vehicles began sliding, crashing into each other, blocking escape routes, and most dangerously, water was rising in the forward compartments. The Express Samina's watertight doors, designed to be closed immediately upon flooding to contain water damage to specific compartments, were not functioning properly. Some doors had been left open for crew convenience, others were mechanically jammed from years of poor maintenance. The result was that flooding spread rapidly through the ship, rather than being contained. By 10:12 p.m., 7 minutes after impact, the bow was completely submerged. The ship's forward mast touched the water. The list increased to 25 degrees, steep enough that walking was nearly impossible without handholds. On deck, crew members struggled to launch lifeboats. The port side boats, on the low side, were being prepared, but the ship's increasing list made even these difficult to deploy. On the starboard side, boats hung uselessly, too high above the water to be useful. Some passengers didn't wait for organized evacuation. They jumped from the tilting decks into the dark water, preferring the risk of swimming to the certainty of staying on a sinking ship. The water was warm, about 23 degrees Celsius, survivable for hours with a life jacket. But it was dark, visibility limited to the lights from the dying ship, and the nearest land, the Porter's rocks the ship had struck, was jagged, dangerous, difficult to reach. Dimitris Portanos made a decision. With his family, he moved to the port side deck, where crew members were preparing a lifeboat, but he saw the chaos, too many people, not enough space, crew unable to maintain order. "We're jumping," he told his family. "Stay together, swim for the rocks." "I'm scared," Maria cried. "I know, but we're wearing life jackets. We'll float. We swim together. Don't let go of each other." They jumped from a height of about 3 meters into the dark Aegean, impacting the water hard but safely. The life jackets brought them back to the surface immediately. They began swimming toward the Portes rocks, visible as dark shapes against the slightly lighter sky. At 10:15 p.m., 10 minutes after impact, the Express Samina's list reached 40 degrees. The ship was now rolling onto its side. Passengers still inside faced desperate choices. Try to climb up through tilted corridors to reach exits, or break windows and swim out. Many were trapped in interior cabins with doors jammed shut by the extreme list. In the vehicle deck, blocked by cars and trucks that had slid into piles. In corridors where the steep angle made climbing impossible, they could hear water rising, feel the ship rolling further, know they were running out of time. Some crew members performed heroically. Second Officer Christos Sidoris remained on the bridge, broadcasting mayday calls, coordinating with approaching rescue vessels, refusing to abandon ship while passengers remained aboard. Chief Engineer Nikos Chalas stayed in the engine room, maintaining power as long as possible to keep lights functioning and pumps running, even as water rose around him. But other crew members abandoned ship early, launching lifeboats with empty seats while passengers remained trapped below. Some jumped into the water and swam for safety without attempting to help passengers. The discipline and training that should have governed evacuation dissolved under panic and self-preservation instinct. At 10:23 p.m., 18 minutes after impact, the Express Samina capsized completely, rolling onto its port side. The starboard side of the hull, now pointing skyward, became a temporary refuge for dozens of people who'd climbed onto the exposed metal. They clung to railings and protrusions, standing on what had been the ship's side, now its highest point, but the ship continued sinking. The bow was fully submerged, pulling the forward section down. The stern began rising. The distinctive death throes of a sinking ship, the moment when the forward section's weight drags the bow down, while the stern, still buoyant, lifts toward the sky. At 10:32 p.m., the Express Samina began its final plunge. The stern rose to about 45 degrees, propellers emerging from the water. People still clinging to the exposed hull slid down the metal into the sea. The ship groaned. a deep, terrible sound of metal tearing and air escaping, and then slipped beneath the surface. 27 minutes. From impact to sinking 27 minutes. For a ship of the Express Samina's size, this was extraordinarily fast. The extensive hull breach, the spread of flooding due to malfunctioning watertight doors, and the lack of effective damage control had doomed the ship. As the ferry disappeared beneath the Aegean, approximately 400 people were in the water, some in lifeboats or clinging to life rafts, some floating in life jackets, some swimming without flotation, some already drowned or drowning. The surface was chaos. People screaming for help, calling for family members, swimming in circles, some quiet and still exhausted or injured or dead. The Portanos family had reached the Portes rocks. They'd pulled themselves onto a partially submerged ledge, cutting their hands and feet on barnacles and sharp stone, but they were out of the water, relatively safe, together. They watched the Express Samina's lights disappear beneath the surface, heard the screams of hundreds in the water, and felt survivors' guilt mixing with relief. Rescue vessels were arriving. The first was a private yacht that had heard the mayday and diverted immediately. Its crew began pulling people from the water, dragging exhausted swimmers aboard, loading life jackets onto the deck. But a yacht can only hold so many people before becoming dangerously overloaded. Greek Coast Guard vessels arrived at 10:45 p.m., 40 minutes after the initial impact. They deployed rescue boats, searchlights and divers. Helicopters arrived, hovering over the scene with spotlights illuminating the water, directing rescue efforts to areas where people floated. The rescue operation continued through the night. People were found clinging to debris, floating unconscious in life jackets, swimming alone miles from the wreck site after drifting with currents. Some rescues were straightforward, pulling tired but healthy people from the water. Others required resuscitation, emergency medical treatment, desperate efforts to revive people who drowned or died from injuries. By dawn on September 27, the scale of tragedy was becoming clear. Approximately 452 people had been rescued alive. That left 81 unaccounted for. Some of those 81 had been pulled from the water dead, drowning victims, people killed during the impact or capsizing, people who died from injuries. But many were simply missing, bodies not yet found, either still in the submerged wreck or carried away by currents. The body recovery operation began immediately. Divers entered the submerged Express Samina, swimming through tilted corridors filled with debris, searching cabins and public spaces. They found bodies trapped in cabins, in stairwells, in the vehicle deck where cars had pinned them. The recovery was slow, dangerous, gruesome work. Over the following weeks, 63 bodies were recovered from the wreck and surrounding waters. 18 people were never found, presumably trapped in inaccessible sections of the wreck or carried out to sea. The final confirmed death toll was 81, 63 recovered bodies plus 18 missing presumed dead. The demographics of the dead reflected the ship's international passenger mix. The victims included 32 Greeks, 14 Germans, 9 British, 6 Swedes and 20 from other nations. Ages ranged from infants to elderly. Entire families had died together. Other families had been split, some members rescued, others lost. Among the dead was Lars Andersson, a 35-year-old Swedish tourist, whose body was found in an interior cabin, wearing a life jacket. He'd clearly prepared for evacuation but been unable to escape before the ship capsized. His cabin door had jammed, trapped by the extreme list. He'd drowned in his cabin, knowing what was happening, unable to do anything about it. Anna Papadopoulos, 8 years old, was found still strapped in her cabin bunk bed. Her family had been unable to reach her before the ship rolled. Her parents had been rescued, she had not. The psychological trauma of parents who survived while children died would persist for years, survivors' guilt compounded by the specific horror of having been separated from their child during disaster. The investigation began while rescue operations continued. Greek authorities, supported by international maritime experts, started gathering evidence, interviewing survivors, examining navigation records, recovering the ship's voyage data recorder, analyzing the wreck, reconstructing the sequence of events. What emerged was a devastating picture of negligence and incompetence. The investigation's most damning discovery came within hours of the sinking. When Captain Vasilis Yiannakis was interviewed by Coast Guard officials on September 27, still wet from his rescue, still in shock from the disaster, he initially claimed he'd been on the bridge at the moment of impact, that the collision was unforeseeable, that he'd done everything possible to save the ship and passengers. this story collapsed within 24 hours. Multiple crew members testified that the captain had left the bridge around 9:45 p.m. His cabin steward reported that the captain had been in his cabin watching television when the impact occurred. And most damningly, investigators recovered the small television from Third Officer Romeo's bridge station tuned to the channel broadcasting the Panathinaikos-Hamburg match. Confronted with this evidence, Yanakis changed his story. He admitted leaving the bridge but claimed it was only for a few minutes, to use the restroom, not to watch football. He insisted he'd returned immediately when he felt the impact. This revised version was also contradicted by evidence and witness testimony. Eventually the full truth emerged. Captain Yanakis had left the bridge at 9:45 p.m. to watch the football match in his cabin. Third Officer Romeo's, left alone on the bridge with only a helmsman, had been simultaneously trying to navigate and watching the same match on a small television he'd brought to the bridge. Neither man had been properly monitoring navigation equipment. The collision alarm had sounded and been silenced. The ship had sailed directly into well-marked rocks because the two people responsible for navigation were watching football instead of the sea. The Greek public's reaction was immediate and furious. The disaster had been broadcast live on television. Cameras on shore had captured the ship's lights listing, capsizing, disappearing. News channels showed rescue operations in real time. The nation watched as bodies were recovered, as survivors told their stories, as the death toll climbed. And then they learned that the captain had been watching football. That 81 people had died because maritime professionals had been more interested in a sports match than in safely navigating their ship. The fury was intense, deeply personal. Greeks are passionate about football, but the idea that football could be prioritized over human life was incomprehensible and unforgivable. Protests erupted outside Minoan Flying Dolphins offices. Survivors and victims' families demanded accountability. Opposition politicians called for criminal prosecutions and industry reform. The government, facing public outrage and international criticism, promised comprehensive investigation and severe penalties. The technical investigation revealed failures extending far beyond the captain's absence from the bridge. The Express Samina's navigation equipment was functioning perfectly, GPS was accurate, radar was operational, collision warnings had activated correctly. The disaster occurred not because equipment failed but because no one was paying attention to functioning equipment. The ship's watertight doors, critical for containing flooding, were found to be poorly maintained and non-functional. Maintenance records showed the doors had been reported as problematic for years but repairs had been repeatedly deferred. Minoan Flying Dolphins had prioritized keeping ships in service over expensive maintenance downtime. The safety briefing, mandatory under international maritime law, had not been conducted. The Express Samina's crew routinely skipped safety briefings to stay on schedule. Passengers boarded, found their seats and sailed without being told where life jackets were stored, where muster stations were located, or what to do in an emergency. Lifeboat drills, required monthly for crew, had not been conducted for 3 months before the disaster. Crew members interviewed during the investigation couldn't correctly identify their emergency duties or describe proper lifeboat launching procedures. Some crew had never participated in a full evacuation drill during their entire time working for the company. The investigation expanded to Minoan Flying Dolphins' entire fleet. Inspectors found similar problems across multiple vessels: deferred maintenance, non-functional safety equipment, inadequate crew training, systematic violations of safety regulations. The company had been cutting costs aggressively, reducing maintenance budgets, hiring inexperienced crew at lower wages, and prioritizing schedule adherence over safety compliance. Most damningly, investigators discovered that Greek maritime authorities had identified many of these problems in previous inspections but had failed to enforce compliance. Inspection reports documented safety violations but follow-up was inconsistent. Ships continued operating despite unresolved violations, fines were minimal and treated as a cost of business rather than a deterrent. This pattern: regulations existing but not enforced, inspections identifying problems but not compelling solutions, companies calculating that violation was cheaper than compliance, created conditions where disaster wasn't a question of if but when. The criminal investigation moved swiftly by Greek judicial standards. Within weeks, arrest warrants were issued for Captain Yanakis, Third Officer Romeo's, Chief Engineer Chalas, and Second Officer Sidiris. All four were charged with manslaughter through negligence, 81 counts, one for each death. The arrests were dramatic and public. Television cameras captured officers being led from their homes in handcuffs. The images satisfied public demand for accountability and sent a clear message: maritime negligence resulting in mass casualties would be prosecuted as serious crime, not merely regulatory violation. The trial began in 2002, nearly 2 years after the disaster. The proceedings lasted 6 months, featured hundreds of witnesses, and dominated Greek media coverage. Survivors testified about the chaotic evacuation, about crew abandoning ship while passengers remained trapped, about the terror of being in a sinking ship with no guidance or help. Technical experts testified about navigation errors, about the impossibility of the collision being accidental or unforeseeable, about how monitoring equipment that was functioning perfectly would have prevented the disaster if anyone had been watching it. Family members of the dead testified about their losses, about children who would never grow up, about parents who died alone and terrified, about the permanent psychological damage to survivors and bereaved families. Captain Yanakis's defense was that he'd left the bridge briefly, that Romeo's had been competent to navigate in his absence, that the collision was ultimately the result of Romeo's errors rather than his own absence. This defense satisfied no one, and convinced no one. Maritime law and tradition hold the captain absolutely responsible for his ship. Whether subordinates make errors is irrelevant. The captain's duty is to ensure competent watchkeeping, and he cannot delegate that responsibility by leaving the bridge. Third Officer Romeo's testified that he'd been overwhelmed, that he was too junior for sole bridge watchkeeping responsibility, that the captain should never have left him alone. His testimony was truthful but damaging to both men. It confirmed that Romeo's had been inadequately supervised and that Yanakis had abandoned his duties. The most dramatic testimony came from Chief Engineer Cullis, who described staying at his post in the engine room as water rose, maintaining power as long as possible, believing that keeping lights on gave passengers better chances of escape. He'd nearly drowned, been rescued unconscious, spent weeks hospitalized. His testimony was moving but didn't excuse his responsibility for the non-functional watertight doors that had allowed flooding to spread uncontrolled. In November 2005, 5 years after the disaster, verdicts were delivered. Captain Yanakis was found guilty on all counts, 81 counts of manslaughter through negligence, plus charges of abandoning ship and failing in duties. Sentence 16 years imprisonment. Third Officer Romeo's guilty 10 years. Chief Engineer Cullis, guilty 8 years. Second Officer Sideris, guilty 6 years. The sentences were severe by Greek standards for non-intentional crimes. They reflected public outrage, the scale of casualties, and judicial determination to send a message that maritime negligence causing mass death would be punished seriously. But the sentences also highlighted a persistent problem in industrial disaster prosecutions. The individuals directly involved faced serious criminal penalties. The company, Minoan Flying Dolphins, faced fines totaling €1.5 million, approximately $1.8 million USD, substantial but not crippling for a company with annual revenues exceeding €50 million. Corporate leadership faced no criminal charges. The company had created conditions that made disaster probable: inadequate maintenance budgets, insufficient crew training, pressure to maintain schedules regardless of safety concerns, systematic violation of regulations. Yet no executives were prosecuted, no board members faced charges, no corporate decision-makers were held personally accountable. This outcome, individual operators imprisoned while corporate executives walk free, is typical of how modern industrial disasters are prosecuted. When systemic failures create disaster conditions, individuals executing within those flawed systems bear criminal responsibility, while those who created the systems face only financial penalties. The families of the 81 dead filed civil lawsuits seeking compensation. The cases were consolidated and settled in 2006 for amounts that varied based on victim age, income, and family circumstances. Average settlements were approximately €200,000 per death, substantial by Greek standards but inadequate compensation for lives lost, especially for families who lost multiple members. Dimitris Portinos, who survived with his family, testified at the trial and received €50,000 in compensation for injuries and psychological trauma. The money paid for years of therapy for his children, who developed anxiety disorders and nightmares. His daughter Maria, who was 11 during the disaster, couldn't enter boats or swim in the sea for a decade afterward. The psychological scars proved more lasting than physical injuries. Anna Papadopoulos's parents, whose 8-year-old daughter had drowned in her cabin bunk, received €350,000. Her father used the money to establish a maritime safety foundation, dedicating his life to preventing similar tragedies. But he never recovered psychologically. "No amount of money brings her back," he said in a 2010 interview. "No punishment of the captain makes her alive. The money is meaningless. The trial was meaningless. She's still dead." The regulatory response was more comprehensive than the judicial response. The European Union, reacting to the disaster and similar ferry accidents, implemented stricter ferry safety standards. The International Maritime Organization revised its Safety of Life at Sea SOLAS conventions to require enhanced crew training, more rigorous equipment maintenance standards, and stricter enforcement mechanisms. Greece specifically reformed its maritime safety regime. The Hellenic Coast Guard received enhanced enforcement powers. Inspection frequency increased. Penalties for violations were raised substantially. Most significantly, a new law required that ferries operating in Greek waters meet the same safety standards as international vessels, eliminating the lower standards that had previously applied to domestic routes. These reforms were effective. Greek ferry safety improved measurably in the decade following Express Samina. No similar mass casualty disasters occurred. Inspections became more thorough and enforcement more consistent. The industry, shocked by the disaster and the severity of criminal penalties, improved training and maintenance, but compliance was imperfect and deteriorated over time. By 2010, a review found that enforcement had relaxed, inspections had become less thorough, and some companies were again deferring maintenance and cutting training budgets. The reforms inspired by 81 deaths were fading as institutional memory faded, as personnel changed, as cost pressures returned. This pattern, disaster reform, gradual decay, appears repeatedly in transportation safety. Catastrophes prompt strict regulations and vigorous enforcement. But over time, absent another disaster, the urgency fades, enforcement relaxes, and conditions gradually revert toward those that caused the original catastrophe. The Express Samina wreck remains on the seabed near Portes, 50 meters deep, partially broken apart, now a dive site. The Greek government designated it a protected area. Diving is permitted but removing artifacts is prohibited. The wreck has become a memorial, visited by divers who leave plaques and flowers, who swim through corridors where 81 people died. Captain Yanakis served 8 years of his 16-year sentence before being released on parole in 2013. He maintained until his death in 2019 that he'd been made a scapegoat, that the disaster wasn't entirely his fault, that the company and regulators shared responsibility. He was technically correct. The company and regulators did share responsibility, but that didn't absolve his own catastrophic failure of duty. Third Officer Romeos served 6 years before release. He never worked in the maritime industry again. In a 2015 interview he said, "I was 25 years old, inexperienced, left alone on the bridge of a ship carrying 533 people. I should never have been in that position. But I was there, and I made mistakes, and people died. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't forgive myself." The psychological burden carried by those directly involved, even those prosecuted and imprisoned, illustrates how disasters create multiple types of victims. The dead cannot suffer guilt. The survivors and perpetrators often suffer for decades. The disaster's impact on Greek tourism was significant but temporary. International visitors avoided Greek ferries for several years after Express Samina, choosing flights or driving instead. Ferry companies lost revenue, some went bankrupt, the industry consolidated. But memory is short, and within a decade, Greek ferry travel had recovered to pre-disaster levels. This recovery demonstrates a troubling reality. Disasters change behavior temporarily, but rarely permanently. People are cautious immediately after catastrophe, but as time passes, caution fades, risks are forgotten, behavior returns to previous patterns. Unless reforms are institutionalized and actively maintained, disaster lessons are lost within a generation. The maritime industry internationally treated Express Samina as a case study in human factors and safety culture. The disaster featured in training programs worldwide, not for its technical complexity, but for its utter preventability. A ship sailing directly into well-marked rocks in perfect weather, equipped with functioning safety equipment, crewed by licensed professionals, a disaster that should have been impossible occurred because people weren't doing their jobs. This pattern, disasters caused not by equipment failure or impossible circumstances, but by human negligence and systemic cultural failures, represents modern industrial safety's greatest challenge. Technology has made catastrophic equipment failures rare. What remains are disasters caused by people not following procedures, organizations not maintaining equipment, regulators not enforcing rules, and cultures that prioritize convenience and profit over safety. The Express Samina disaster joined a grim catalogue of ferry catastrophes caused by similar factors. The MS Estonia sank in 1994, killing 852 people due to a faulty bow door and poor watertight integrity. The MV Sewol capsized in South Korea in 2014, killing 304, most of them schoolchildren, when the captain ordered them to stay in their cabins while he abandoned ship. The MV Lardjane capsized in Senegal in 2002, killing 1,863 people, while grossly overloaded and top-heavy. Each disaster had unique circumstances, but all shared common factors: regulatory failure, inadequate safety culture, cost-cutting at expense of safety, crew incompetence or negligence, and passengers who trusted that professionals were keeping them safe when actually no one was watching the systems designed to protect them. The 81 victims of Express Samina were mostly tourists, people on vacation, people who'd boarded a ferry expecting routine travel and never imagining they'd die because the captain wanted to watch football. Their deaths were senseless, preventable, and ultimately changed less than they should have. Memorials exist: a monument in Psarros, plaques at the wreck site, annual ceremonies attended by survivors and families, but these are quiet remembrances, known mainly to those directly affected. The disaster doesn't occupy prominent place in Greek or international consciousness. It's known to maritime professionals, studied in safety courses, remembered by those who lost loved ones. But for most people, it's obscure history, a tragedy that happened, was mourned, was judged, and was forgotten. This forgetting is dangerous. The lessons of Express Samina, that safety systems only work when humans attend to them, that regulations without enforcement are worthless, that organizational culture determines whether disasters occur, these lessons are universal and perpetual. They don't become outdated or irrelevant. But they're forgotten anyway, because human nature resists learning from other people's disasters until we experience our own. Captain Vasilis Yanakis left the bridge at 9:45 p.m. on September 26, 2000, to watch a football match. He believed nothing could go wrong in his absence. The weather was perfect, the route was familiar, the equipment was functioning, his officers were competent. He was wrong on the last point, catastrophically wrong. But more fundamentally, he was wrong in believing that routine circumstances eliminate risk, that experienced mariners don't need to follow procedures, that captains can delegate responsibility for navigation by simply leaving the bridge. 20 minutes. That's how long he was gone. 20 minutes to watch the first half of a football match. In those 20 minutes, his ship sailed into rocks marked on every chart, warned by every alarm system, visible on radar, completely avoidable if anyone had been watching. 81 people died because two men wanted to watch football more than they wanted to do their jobs. That sentence seems absurd, impossible, an exaggeration, but it's literally true. The investigation found no equipment failures, no unforeseeable circumstances, no impossible navigation challenges. Just two men not watching where a ship carrying 533 people was going, because a football match was more interesting than their professional duties.